When the billionaire founder told her to pack her things in front of 21 executives, most people in the room assumed the meeting was already over. What no one noticed was how calmly she closed her laptop, because buried inside the contract they had all signed was a clause none of them had bothered to read twice. The boardroom on the 32nd floor always felt colder than the rest of the building. Not because of the air conditioning, because of the silence that lived there. Mahogany table, 21 leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline like a painting of power and money. Every executive in the room knew that meetings here rarely ended quietly. And today, the silence had teeth. Victoria sat halfway down the table, her laptop open, fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. Not typing, just waiting. Across from her, at the head of the table, Richard Hale leaned back in his chair. Billionaire founder. Media darling. The man whose name sat in polished steel letters on the building outside. Her father-in-law. He tapped a Mont Blanc pen once against the table. A small sound, but in that room, it carried like a dropped coin in a cathedral. "Let's not waste time," he said. Several executives shifted in their seats. Victoria's husband, Daniel, sat 2 chairs to Richard's right. His arms were folded, and there was something almost amused about the way the corner of his mouth lifted. That tiny smirk did not belong in a boardroom, not during a meeting about a project worth 9 figures. Victoria noticed it anyway. Richard's gaze landed on her like a spotlight. "Victoria," he said calmly, "pack your things." A pause rippled through the room. Someone near the windows inhaled sharply. "You're off the project," he continued. "Effective immediately." The words landed softly, but the air shifted. 21 executives suddenly became very interested in their notebooks. No one interrupted a billionaire founder, not publicly, not in his own boardroom. Victoria didn't speak. She simply blinked once. Across the table, Daniel leaned back further in his chair, the smirk growing just a little wider. "Interesting," Richard continued, voice smooth as polished glass. "You've done admirable work," he said, "but the board believes the project requires a different leadership direction." Different leadership direction. Corporate language had a way of turning knives into paperwork. Victoria glanced slowly around the table. No one met her eyes, except the company counsel, Julia Mendel. Julia's fingers were frozen halfway over a legal pad. For a fraction of a second, something unreadable crossed her face. Then she lowered her gaze. Another interesting detail. Victoria closed her laptop. The sound of the lid clicking shut echoed lightly in the room. No argument, no raised voice, just quiet. For a moment, Richard seemed almost disappointed. He probably expected resistance, drama, emotion. Instead, Victoria placed both hands calmly on the table. "Understood," she said. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. The room exhaled. Executives began exchanging small glances. The silent language of people relieved the confrontation might be over. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Victoria slid a slim folder across the table. It stopped exactly in front of counsel. Julia Mendel looked up. Richard frowned slightly. "What's that?" he asked. Victoria's tone stayed calm. "Just documentation for the project transition." No one moved. Then Julia slowly opened the folder. Inside were 3 pages. The first page contained the development agreement for the project. The second page was a signature page. The third page, Julia's eyes stopped. Her expression didn't change, but the room felt it anyway. Because lawyers had a particular kind of silence when they found something unexpected. Julia flipped the page back, then forward again. She adjusted her glasses. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair now, the smirk fading by a millimeter. Richard noticed the shift too. "Julia?" he said. The counsel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she read a line again. Then again. The room grew very still. Outside the windows, the city moved normally, cars flowing through traffic, sunlight reflecting off glass towers. Inside the boardroom, Something invisible had just tilted. Julia closed the folder carefully. She didn't look at Richard. She looked at Victoria. "For the record," she said slowly, "when was this agreement signed?" Victoria folded her hands. 18 months ago." A quiet murmur moved through the table. Richard's voice sharpened. "Julia." Counsel turned. "Yes." "What are we looking at?" Julia hesitated, and hesitation from legal counsel was never a good sign in a boardroom. She placed a finger on the page. "There is a clause attached to the development control structure." Richard's brow tightened. "What clause?" Julia read the header. Section 9. Daniel leaned forward slightly now. Richard's pen stopped tapping. Julia looked up, and for the first time since the meeting began, the billionaire founder no longer looked like the person fully in control of the room. Victoria watched quietly, because sometimes the most powerful move in a boardroom was simply letting people read the contract they had already signed. And when Julia reached the final line of Section 9, her pen stopped moving. Completely. If the room had been silent before, now it felt like gravity itself was holding its breath, because whatever she had just read had changed the direction of the meeting, and no one in the room understood how. Yet, you'll want to see what that clause actually said. Julia Mendel did something unusual for a corporate counsel. She read the clause again. Slowly. Not because the language was complicated. Contracts at this level were written with surgical precision. No poetry, no ambiguity, just steel hidden in paragraphs. But sometimes steel was buried deep enough that no one noticed it until pressure was applied. Around the table, executives shifted. Richard Hale disliked waiting. Everyone in the company knew that. "Julia," he said again, voice tightening just a little. "I assume this isn't complicated." Julia lifted her eyes from the page. "Actually," she said carefully, "it's very clear." That answer did not calm the room. Victoria sat motionless, hands folded. The sunlight from the windows behind the executives cast long reflections across the table, like lines dividing territory. Daniel finally leaned forward. "What clause are we talking about?" he asked, impatience creeping into his voice. Julia turned the folder slightly so the page faced the center of the table. "Section 9, she said. "Control rights." A quiet murmur passed between two executives near the end of the table. One of them reached for his copy of the contract, flipping pages quickly. Paper rustled. Another executive did the same. Within seconds, 3 people were searching. But Julia already had the line highlighted. She read it aloud. "Under the development agreement, operational and strategic control of Project Atlas is assigned to the originating architect of the initiative for the duration of the project lifecycle." She paused. Richard frowned. "That's standard language," he said. Julia nodded slowly. "Yes." Her finger moved to the next line. "Unless control is voluntarily relinquished or transferred by written consent." The room remained quiet. Richard leaned back again. "So?" Julia inhaled softly. "The originating architect listed in the agreement is Victoria Hale." For the first time since the meeting began, several heads turned directly toward Victoria. Not politely, directly. The atmosphere shifted. Daniel's smirk disappeared completely. "That's irrelevant," he said quickly. "The board can reassign leadership." Julia didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid the folder 2 inches toward Richard. "Please continue reading." Richard picked up the page. He scanned the paragraph, then the next. His expression didn't change, but something subtle tightened along his jaw. Across the table, the executives who had found the same clause in their own contracts were now reading silently. And silence spreads fast in rooms where power is involved. Daniel leaned toward his father. "What does it say?" he asked under his breath. Richard didn't respond. He kept reading, because the clause did not end with control rights. It continued. Paragraph 3. Julia spoke again. There is an additional provision tied to the financing structure. Victoria remained still. Her calm was beginning to look less like composure and more like preparation. Julia tapped the paragraph lightly. Project Atlas is financed through the Innovation Partnership Vehicle created 18 months ago. One executive near the window suddenly sat up straighter. Wait, he said quietly. That partnership agreement. Julia nodded. Yes. She looked around the room. And the partnership charter designates Victoria Hale as the controlling managing partner. Now the silence thickened. Not confusion, calculation. Because everyone in that room understood one thing. Control structures mattered more than titles. Richard finally placed the document back on the table. His voice was calm again. Too calm. That's a technicality. Julia did not agree. Nor did she disagree. She simply continued. If the originating architect also holds managing control of the financing entity, she let the sentence hang for a moment, then finished it. Removal from the project requires voluntary consent. A chair creaked somewhere near the end of the table. Someone had leaned back. Daniel spoke again, sharper this time. This is ridiculous. The board oversees the company. Julia turned toward him. Yes. Then she added one more sentence. But the company does not own Project Atlas. The words landed like a stone dropped into water. Small sound, large ripple. Richard's pen stopped moving completely now. What do you mean the company doesn't own it? He asked. Julia gestured toward the document. The intellectual property, development rights, and financing structure were placed inside the partnership vehicle when the project was created. She looked directly at Victoria. And that partnership, a beat, is legally controlled by her. No one spoke. Outside, the sunlight shifted slightly across the glass towers of the city. Inside the boardroom, 21 executives were silently recalculating the last 18 months of decisions. Because the meeting that had begun as a dismissal was now starting to look like something else entirely. Richard leaned forward slowly. His voice was quiet. Julia. Yes. How long would it take to review the full implications of this clause? Julia closed the folder carefully. She didn't rush the answer. 11 minutes, she said. The room froze, because Victoria had closed her laptop exactly 11 minutes ago. And suddenly, that detail no longer looked accidental. If you think the tension in that room was high now, wait until counsel finished the review. If you were sitting in that boardroom, what would you do next? Stay silent like the executives? Or speak up? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where quiet intelligence wins, make sure you follow for the next chapter. The boardroom did not move for several seconds after Julia said it. 11 minutes, not 10, not about 15. Exactly 11. And that precision made people uneasy. Because precision usually meant preparation. Richard Hale leaned back slowly in his chair again. The billionaire founder had built his reputation on controlling rooms like this one, rooms where people hesitated before speaking and agreements were sealed before coffee cooled. But something had shifted. The air in the room felt different, not rebellious. Worse, careful. Victoria watched the skyline outside the windows for a moment before turning back to the table. The city looked calm from 32 floors up, the afternoon sun washing the buildings in quiet gold. Inside the boardroom, however, tension was threading through every seat. Julia Mendel opened her laptop. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done legal reviews for billion-dollar deals and crisis negotiations alike. Her fingers moved across the keyboard. 3 documents appeared on the screen: the partnership charter, the development agreement, and the financing addendum. Julia scanned the first document quickly, then the second. No one interrupted. Even Daniel had stopped shifting in his chair. Finally, Richard spoke again. Julia, he said evenly, walk us through it. The counsel nodded once. Very well. She turned the laptop slightly so the screen faced the table. Project Atlas was structured outside the parent corporation 18 months ago. One executive near the center of the table frowned. That was for tax efficiency. Julia nodded. Yes. But she didn't stop there. It also created an independent governance structure. Richard's eyes narrowed. Julia continued calmly. The partnership vehicle, Atlas Development Partners, holds the intellectual property, licensing rights, and operational contracts. She clicked once. A diagram appeared. Several executives leaned forward. Because diagrams in legal reviews were rarely good news. This entity, Julia said, pointing to the center box, is controlled by the managing partner. She paused, then looked up. Victoria Hale. A low breath escaped someone near the far end of the table. Daniel leaned toward the screen now. That doesn't override board authority, he said quickly. Julia nodded again. The board governs the corporation. Another click. But the corporation does not legally control Atlas Development Partners. She zoomed into the governance clause. Control of the partnership requires either unanimous partner approval, her finger traced the final line, or voluntary relinquishment by the managing partner. Silence expanded across the room, because every executive present understood the implication instantly. Victoria had not relinquished anything. Richard tapped the pen once again, but the sound lacked the earlier confidence. Julia, he said, the company funded the project. Julia answered without hesitation. The company funded a minority stake in the partnership. She turned another page. 48%. That number hung in the air. 48, not 51. A quiet rustle passed along the table. Someone whispered something to the executive beside him. Daniel's jaw tightened. That structure was temporary. Julia lifted one eyebrow slightly. The agreement contains no expiration clause. Another silence. This one heavier. Victoria still hadn't spoken. She sat calmly, her laptop closed in front of her, hands folded lightly, as if she were simply observing a meeting rather than standing in the center of it. Richard watched her now, carefully. You knew about this, he said. Victoria met his gaze. Yes. The honesty of the answer landed harder than denial would have. Richard's voice lowered. And you didn't mention it. Victoria tilted her head slightly. It's written in the contract. Several executives shifted again. Because technically, she was right. Contracts existed precisely so people wouldn't need reminders. Julia closed the laptop halfway. Counsel's conclusion is straightforward, she said. Richard waited. Julia spoke clearly. Removing Victoria Hale from Project Atlas without her consent would violate Section 9 and the partnership charter. A pause followed. Then she added the part no one had asked yet. And doing so would trigger a control dispute. Daniel frowned. What does that mean in practice? Julia answered calmly. It means operational control of the project would remain with her while the dispute is resolved. She glanced around the room. In other words, the project continues under her authority. Another long silence. The skyline outside had begun to dim slightly as clouds drifted across the sun. Inside the boardroom, 21 executives were recalculating something else entirely now. Not just the contract, but the meeting, because what had begun as a dismissal was starting to look dangerously close to a legal misstep. Richard placed both hands on the table. His voice returned to that measured calm he used during investor calls. Victoria. She looked up. Yes. What exactly do you intend to do now? The question hung between them, because the room expected confrontation, or triumph, or at least a hint of revenge. But Victoria simply leaned back slightly in her chair and said something that made several executives exchange uneasy glances. I intend, she said quietly, to continue the meeting. For a moment, no one understood why those words felt so unsettling. until one executive slowly turned the page of the financial briefing in front of him. Because the next item on the agenda was the project approval vote. And suddenly, everyone in the room realized something uncomfortable. The meeting had never actually ended. For several seconds after Victoria spoke, no one moved. Not because they didn't understand her words, because they suddenly understood them too well. I intend to continue the meeting. Such a simple sentence, almost polite, but in that moment, it carried a quiet authority that hadn't been there earlier. The boardroom had changed, subtly, quietly, like a chessboard where the pieces hadn't moved yet, but everyone had suddenly realized the position was different. Richard Hale studied her across the table. The billionaire founder had built companies from nothing. He had negotiated hostile acquisitions, crushed competitors, and closed deals in rooms far more hostile than this one. But there was something uniquely uncomfortable about this situation, because it wasn't a fight. It was structure, and structure could not be intimidated. Around the table, executives glanced at each other cautiously. The quiet alliances that normally formed in corporate rooms were suddenly uncertain. Who actually controlled the project? The company? Or the partnership? Julia Mendel broke the silence. The agenda item, she said calmly, is still pending. She tapped the printed briefing packet in front of her. Project Atlas Expansion Authorization. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched Victoria for a long moment. You're suggesting, he said slowly, that we proceed with the vote. Victoria nodded once. That was the purpose of the meeting. Her tone was neither confrontational nor defensive, just factual, and that made it even more difficult to challenge. Daniel leaned forward sharply. This is absurd. His voice carried more heat than anyone else in the room had used so far. You were just removed from the project. Victoria looked at him, calmly. No, she said. The correction was gentle, but it landed like a quiet hammer. I was asked to leave. A subtle difference. Yet every executive in the room felt it, because legally, those two things were not the same. Daniel opened his mouth again, but Richard raised one hand slightly. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to stop him. The room fell silent again. Richard exhaled slowly. Julia, he said, from a legal standpoint, if we continue this meeting. Julia answered immediately. The vote remains valid. Another pause. And Victoria? She retains operational authority under Section 9. Richard looked down at the documents in front of him. For the first time since the meeting began, he seemed to be considering something beyond immediate control. Across the table, Victoria waited. Patiently. The skyline outside had shifted into the muted gold of late afternoon now, reflections sliding across the glass buildings like slow-moving waves. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere felt less like confrontation and more like recalculation. Finally, Richard leaned back. Very well. Several executives straightened slightly. Because when the founder spoke those words, decisions usually followed. We will proceed. Daniel turned toward him. Dad. Richard didn't look at him. Enough. The word was quiet, but final. Daniel leaned back slowly, frustration tightening his shoulders. Julia opened the agenda again. Item 3, she said. Authorization for Phase 2 development. A slide appeared on the large screen at the end of the room. Revenue projections, expansion strategy, international licensing. The numbers were large enough to make even seasoned executives shift in their seats. Victoria glanced at the screen only briefly. She had seen those numbers hundreds of times. After all, she had built them. Julia looked around the table. Before we proceed to vote, she said, the managing partner typically presents the final recommendation. Her eyes moved toward Victoria. 21 executives turned at once. For the first time since the meeting began, the room was waiting for her to speak. Not defensively, not reluctantly, but officially. Victoria stood slowly. No dramatic gestures, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew the room had already changed. She walked to the screen. The soft click of her heels echoed faintly across the floor. When she turned back toward the table, the late sunlight framed her silhouette against the skyline. And suddenly, the earlier moment, when she had calmly closed her laptop, made a lot more sense, because she had never lost control of the meeting. Not for a second. She placed one hand lightly on the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began. Her voice carried easily across the room. "Let's talk about where Project Atlas goes next." At the far end of the table, one executive leaned slightly toward another and whispered something almost inaudible, but the words were clear enough. She planned this, and the uncomfortable truth was, he might be right. She didn't need to. Boardrooms have their own acoustics. Confidence travels farther than volume, and right now the room was tuned entirely to her frequency. She stood beside the screen where the Atlas projections glowed in soft blues and whites. The numbers looked almost serene against the glass skyline behind them. Revenue curves, market expansion, licensing agreements across 3 continents. For a project she had built from nothing. Project Atlas, Victoria began, was designed to move faster than traditional corporate structures allow. Her tone was conversational, almost reflective. But the executives listened with a level of attention they hadn't offered earlier. Because earlier they believed the power in the room sat at the head of the table. Now they weren't so sure. She clicked the remote. A new slide appeared. Phase 2 expands the licensing framework into 3 additional markets. She glanced briefly toward Richard. No additional capital risk to the corporation. One executive near the windows nodded slowly. Another scribbled something in his notebook. Daniel, however, remained rigid in his chair. Victoria continued. The partnership structure was built specifically to allow rapid deployment. She paused just long enough for the words to settle. That structure remains intact. A quiet ripple moved across the table. Not disagreement, recognition. Richard leaned forward slightly. "You anticipated resistance," he said. It wasn't an accusation, more like an observation. Victoria met his gaze calmly. "I anticipated growth." The answer hung in the air, because technically, it wasn't a denial. Julia Mendel watched the exchange with professional neutrality, though her eyes moved briefly between the two of them, the founder and the managing partner, 2 different types of authority. Victoria clicked the remote again. The final slide appeared, a simple recommendation line. Authorize Phase 2 development. She placed the remote on the table. "My recommendation," she said, "is to proceed." The boardroom remained silent for a moment. Then Richard Hale did something unexpected. He laughed, not loudly, just a short, thoughtful exhale of amusement. 21 executives looked up. Richard leaned back slowly. "I've run this company for 30 years, he said. His voice carried that familiar calm power again. "But I will admit," he glanced toward Julia, "I should have read Section 9 more carefully." A few executives allowed themselves small smiles. The tension in the room loosened by a fraction. Richard folded his hands. "Well," he continued, "the meeting is still in progress." He looked around the table. "All those in favor of authorizing Phase 2. Hands began to rise. First 1, then 3, then 10. Within seconds, nearly the entire table had voted. Even the executives who had avoided Victoria's eyes earlier. Daniel was the last to move. His hand rose slowly. The vote passed, unanimous. Julia made a note in the record. Authorization approved. The words sounded simple, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. Richard looked across the table at Victoria. "You built something impressive," he said. There was no sarcasm in the statement, just recognition. Victoria nodded once. "Thank you." He studied her a moment longer. Then he closed the folder in front of him. "Well," he said calmly, I believe the meeting has reached its conclusion. Chairs began to move. Executives gathered papers. Quiet conversations started along the edges of the table. But before anyone left, Richard added one final sentence. Victoria. She turned. Yes? He gestured toward the skyline. Next time, he said, with the faintest hint of a smile, warn me before you outmaneuver my boardroom. Victoria considered that for a second. Then she answered gently. The contract did. And with that, she picked up her laptop. Not hurried, not triumphant. Just calm. Because the most powerful victories in a boardroom rarely came from shouting. They came from the quiet moment when everyone realized someone had already written the rules and simply followed them. The boardroom slowly came back to life. Chairs moved, folders closed, quiet conversations formed in small clusters along the long mahogany table. The kind of conversations executives have when they realize a meeting has shifted in ways no one predicted. But something else had changed. Earlier, people avoided looking at Victoria. Now they were watching her. Not openly, but carefully. Because power inside companies often moved invisibly, and everyone in that room had just witnessed a rare moment when it moved in plain sight. Victoria placed the presentation remote back on the table and closed her folder. No dramatic gestures, no victory speech, just the quiet routine of someone finishing her part of the meeting. Across the table, Richard Hale remained seated. The Billionaire founder had not rushed to leave like the others. Instead, he watched the room the way experienced leaders do, studying reactions, measuring consequences. Julia Mendel leaned toward him briefly and said something under her breath. Richard nodded once. Daniel stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a sharper sound than necessary. His expression had hardened. This is ridiculous, he said quietly to no one in particular. But no one responded, because the vote had already happened. Unanimous. Daniel looked toward Victoria, as if expecting some kind of reaction, but she simply slid her laptop into her bag. Calmly. The lack of confrontation seemed to frustrate him even more. He left the room without another word. The door closed softly behind him. A few executives exchanged quick glances. Not sympathy. Observation. Because boardrooms remember moments like this. Victoria walked toward the windows for a moment while the room cleared. 32 floors above the city, the skyline stretched out under the warm glow of early evening. Traffic moved like slow ribbons of light between the buildings. Behind her, Julia approached quietly. Section 9, the counsel said softly, was thorough. Victoria smiled slightly. Contracts should be. Julia studied her for a moment. You expected today. Victoria shook her head once. I expected the project to grow. Another technically honest answer. Julia gave a small professional nod and left to collect the remaining documents. Soon only 2 people remained in the boardroom, Victoria and Richard Hale. The founder stood slowly and walked toward the window beside her. For a moment, they both looked out over the city. 2 reflections in the glass. Different generations. Different strategies. Same skyline. You surprised the room, Richard said finally. Victoria didn't answer immediately. Most people assume power sits where the title is, she said. Richard chuckled quietly. That assumption has made many careers. He turned toward her. And ended others. Victoria met his gaze calmly. Richard studied her for a long second. Not as a father-in-law, not even as a chairman, as a strategist. Then he gave a small approving nod. Project Atlas, he said, is clearly in capable hands. Victoria picked up her laptop bag. Thank you. She walked toward the door. Before leaving, she paused. Richard. He looked up. Yes? She spoke in the same calm tone she had used throughout the entire meeting. The partnership report will be circulated tomorrow morning. Richard smiled slightly. Of course it will. Victoria stepped into the hallway. The door closed quietly behind her. Inside the boardroom, Richard Hale remained by the window for a moment longer, watching the city. Then he glanced once more at the folder lying on the table. Section 9. Control Rights. He tapped the page lightly with his pen and laughed to himself, not out of defeat, but respect. Because in business, the most dangerous move was rarely the loudest one. It was the moment someone quietly followed the rules better than everyone else.